Good evening. Welcome. Um, Today we'll be talking about Robert's book, Bombay Imagined, a book that explores imagined futures of a city that either you might call a city of dreams or nightmares, as the case may be, but a city that seems to have fascinated its residents, visitors, even our occupiers, colonizers over the centuries. Perhaps a city that never should have been, because with its strange shape and its geography, its terrain, none of which seem to lend themselves to being the foundation, to a foundation for a great city. But there you go, you have Mumbai, Bombay, as you want to call it. Great city, terrible place, as Korea put it rather eloquently many years ago. So, this sort of strange and unlikely garland of islands stitched together that somehow seems to have inspired countless number of people. It's to conjure up ideas that are practical, sometimes doable, very necessary, sometimes critical, and by turns fantastical, even poignant. All of these you will soon see in Robert's presentation. But I think underlying all of them is one common emotion, and that seems to be a great love for the city and a desire to somehow make it better. Perhaps it's this sense of hope and optimism that makes us, each one of us, dream about our own cities, no matter where we live. And perhaps it is this emotion that propelled Robert to write this book. Robert is an architect who came to Mumbai in 2007 as an intern to work at Rahul Mehrotra Associates and stayed on to being one of its principals, so 15 years, finding both, I think, love for the city and the love of your life. And definitely a love great enough to make him write this wonderful, very interesting book. So, Robert, a very warm welcome to you. Slightly, not so wet, but warm welcome. Yeah. Thank God for that. So I think we'll go directly to your presentation. It's a beautiful presentation. I have seen it before. And we'll give the audience just a glimpse of what is inside the book, only a glimpse, to truly understand what what is inside that book. You have to buy it. It is a treasure. So I think over to you, Robert, now.
Good evening. Very, very happy to see so many of you here. Thank you. We're going to begin Bombay Imagined actually in 1869 with this book you see on the screen. And I'm not sure anyone here, if like me, you love drainage. I love drainage. I love reading these archival texts about sanitation. Often the literature, it stinks, but it's nutrient rich. The content's very, very rich and great fodder for growth. So Bombay Imagined really began in 1869 with this book, Professional Papers on Indian Engineering. And in this, I came across Hector Tulloch's report called Drainage of Bombay, a very attractive title. And as I was reading through this was in about 2013, I came across this beautiful fold-out map. It's the island of Bombay, and it had this very intriguing green blob right in the middle of the city. And I said, what is this? This very amorphous shape. I zoomed in, and it was a proposed park, right? And I've by this point, I'd been in the city about 6 years and I was quite intrigued. What is this proposed park? Started searching and realized this was Arthur Crawford's plan for a 400-acre public space in the middle of the island city. Now, one of the really interesting things about this park, it wasn't just a park. At the entrance, it had a statue. It was to have a statue of a fool in a cap, right? Very interesting. Think of the most foolish person you know, put a cap on him. That's the statue at the entrance of the park. Below it in 4 languages was this quote, "Forgive us, for we know not what we did." Right? So Crawford's plan was to create this memorial to previous commissioners in Bombay who had dumped all the city's waste and refuge in this part of the island city, right? It was reckless waste management, and this statue was to reflect on that. I like to think if his statue had come to pass, we would not have this, the Maloon dumping ground, or this, the Deonar dumping ground, one of the largest landfills in India, in the world, which you see right here. Now, Deonar is quite, it's in the northeastern part of the city. It's quite similar to Crawford's plan. In 1981, there was this scheme to create a city park atop Deonar. Now, of course, this didn't happen, and the landfill continues to function today as an active piece of infrastructure. So coming back to Crawford's park, this was his vision. A people's park such as London does not possess. This was the man himself. I love his mustache is quite in keeping with the times, I think. And this was where he wrote about this plan, amongst many others, in publication, The Development of New Bombay. And I love this title because that phrase, New Bombay, as architects, we often think of it as coming kind of into use in the 1960s when Korea, Pravina Mehta and Sharish Patel coined the term, but as early as the 1870s, Crawford's already thinking Bombay needs newness. We need a new Bombay, and he writes about it quite extensively. This was one of the plans in this book. It was a beautification scheme for the Mumbai Devi Temple tank. This is what he wrote. "A place more beautiful and picturesque than the Place Vendôme in Paris. Ghat-like steps in black and white marble were to lead down to the water's edge, while gardens with seats were to bifurcate the descent." So this is really beautiful because Crawford realizes that tanks in Bombay have this special meaning, not just for their presence, reservoirs of water, but as cultural and spiritual spaces. He recognizes that and tries to beautify them, bring them into the cultural life of the city even more so. So thanks to Crawford, I just started searching, started thinking, what other plans were there for Bombay that were imagined, dreamed, but never came to pass? Started researching and just kept finding content, and it was super exciting. We're in about 2015 now. I compiled this manuscript and got to about 100 projects, and I thought, boom, this is going to happen. This is going to be a book in 1 or 2 years, and it'll be really exciting, and everyone will love it. It sat in my wardrobe, and then it sat for many years. And this is why. My wife Tina and I were expecting our son, and in early 2016, late 2015, we made 2 decisions. We said, first, we're going to have a home birth. Our son's going to be born at home under the supervision of a midwife. Second thing was, we said we want to have a water birth, which is what it sounds like, a birth in a kiddie pool in water. So we found the midwife. Tina went into labor early one morning. And by the afternoon, around 2 o'clock, we got a knock on the door. And I was a little panicked. Who could be, bothering us at this point in our lives? And it was security guard. And I opened. I said, "What is it?" He said, "Saab, आज 5 बजे से कल सुबह 7 बजे पानी नहीं मिलेगा. कुछ भी नहीं, water cut, 100% water cut." I panicked. Said there will be no water from 5 to 7, right? The one day we were planning to have a water birth, there's no water. So this was 2 p.m. The water cut started at 5. We quickly managed, filled up the tub, and late that night, our son Kairav was born. And that was a really great experience. Of course, for 2 years, life went completely for a toss. But what began as this kind of very serious and scholarly project, Bombay's Unbuilt History, all of a sudden, after Kairav's birth, became playful and artistic. And over time, we just kind of fused these two qualities into what the book is today. So we're really grateful for his contribution. Speaking of water, amongst the first requisites of a large and growing city is a plentiful supply of fresh and wholesome water. LCC Rivet 1845, right? We felt that. 2016, you have to have water for life. LCC Rivet felt it then. This was the first plan, at least first visually documented plan to increase Bombay's water supply. It was a series of filtering wells in Bombay's tanks. There were hundreds of tanks across the island city. Each of these black dots you see in this map were tanks, open-to-air tanks. And Henry Conybeare said, in each of these tanks, let's sink these filtering wells to purify water and make it potable. That didn't happen. Basically, they said we need more water. And instead of looking for localized water supply in the island city, everyone started looking for these mega reservoirs outside the city. This was in Shelwa, about 90 kilometers from Bombay. Alternately, a series of plans were made in the hills of Salsette, in suburban, what is now suburban Bombay, that you see here. And we're going to zoom in on this particular proposal. It was called the Canadi Reservoir. It was spread over 500 acres. And the biggest flaw of this, it would have required the largest earthen dam, masonry dam in the world at the time. It was too expensive, too risky, and this never went forward. This is 1868, Russell Aitken. 100 years later, 1961, the BMC proposes the exact same lake in the same location. Now it's called Dahisar Lake. This would have submerged 200,000 trees. It would have been, of course, an environmental disaster. Fortunately, the government tried to charge so much money for the land that they already owned, they couldn't afford it. So it was this bizarre catch-22. This also fell apart in many ways, thankfully. Now, water supply, right? So we found ways to get water into Bombay. The next challenge is getting it out. And that's particularly tricky for the island city because one, it's an island, and two, as you see in this map, the center of the island is a depression, right? It's the lowest point of the landmass, showing areas below sea level shaded. It's all below sea level, which means basically Bombay's a bathtub, right? It's a giant bathtub. Now, how do you get water out of a bathtub? In Nietzsche say you pull the plug and it drains, which we can't do in Bombay because it's the Arabian Sea surrounding. Second option is you get a bucket and you need to kind of chuck the water out of the bathtub. There's our bucket. We're going to look at the bucket for a bit. Perhaps the most extraordinary proposition ever yet made public for the drainage of any town, Wilcox and Tracy, 1860. They were talking about this plan. It was this idea for a giant Ferris wheel type structure in the lowest part of the island. So you had all the sewage, wastewater from the city came to this low-lying part of the city, this kind of belly. From there, it was to be picked up by this big Ferris wheel, dumped into a funnel, and then discarded at sea. Now, William Perks, who wrote about this in 1858, he wrote very vividly. He described everything, the size, the scale, the atmosphere of this scheme, but there was no drawing. So this is one of the 30 projects in Bombay Imagined where we took that literary content and then created visual content for the first time in history. This was the initial sketch, and then with an artist in Bombay, we created this. These are the process images. In the background is Haji Ali. Far left is Kumbala Hill. And this was the final piece. This is Samuel Perks' lift wheel. I absolutely love it. You can see the funnel at the bottom right. That funnel then took all the sewage and led it to the sea. 1866, this was a separate proposal. What you see in arrows, that's the profile of the island city. So again, you see the bathtub. And what Russell Aitken said in this scheme, he said, let's create a giant 10-foot diameter sewer under the city, straight from the inner city to Colaba. In red, this was the sewer, and it was designed keeping in mind the Cloaca Maxima in Rome. This was the 600 BC reference that Aitken had in mind when he imagined this giant sewer. And then, of course, the wastewater was to be shipped out to sea from Colaba. This was too big, too disruptive, and it never happened. 1 year later, Hector Tulloch, we started with his book on drainage. He comes up with another scheme for an underground railway. I love this. This is one of my favorites. What he said is from roughly what is now Satrasta, at the time Jacob Circle, to Fort, there should be a railway line, partly underground, partly above ground. And this is how he described it. During the day, passengers were to be ferried southwards into the city center, while at night, northbound carriages filled with the day's business, fecal matter, were to traverse the same tracks. That was literally his proposal. So, Bombay, we have very specific railway lines. We have the Western Line, we have the Central Line, Harbour Line, Dream Line is a new under construction route, Red Line is a new metro route, and I like to think this would have been called the Brown Line. Yeah, and it would have had the symbol, I think, would have been this giant streak. It was Bombay's Brown Line. So he didn't stop with just getting poop out of Fort. He got it up to Jacob Circle. From there, he proposed it should be dumped into a sewer, above ground sewer, which led to what is now basically BKC. And then there it was to just be spread over wasteland to irrigate fields. And everything you see in red, this is lands on which the sewage might be utilized. Now, of course, why do this? Chambur Bandra for reference. Why do this? What are the advantages? One, the price of vegetables is ridiculously high in Bombay, and it is hoped that if sewage irrigation is carried out, prices will be reduced. And I love this quote. This is Arthur Crawford, right? We often think of him as just the man behind Crawford Market, but he thought really deeply about every aspect of life in Bombay, from that 400-acre park to reducing inflation in vegetables. Great, interesting man. This is him again, in case you forgot. So we have our bathtub. We've got water in it. Water's a bit dirty. Of course, we're surrounded by the Arabian Sea. So these edges become really critical. And we're going to just walk through the history of one edge this evening, Marine Drive, kind of the most famous urban edge, possibly, of Bombay. This is an early engraving from the 1850s. And a few things to just notice here. This is, of course, Back Bay. What you see on the right, top right, that's the entrance to a graveyard. And then you see cremations happening on the sands of Back Bay. Now, this was a big problem because this was one of Bombay's few open spaces, and just the deceased were everywhere. So Henry Conybeare, who also proposed those filtering wells to purify water in the island city, he said, let's take the burial ground and relocate it to the eastern slope of Malabar Hill. He said, basically, Malabar Hill is useless because it's so steep, it can never be used for construction. I like that idea today. And he said, let's then create on the purified sands what he called a marine parade, right? And that's basically the first hint of this idea of Marine Drive, a marine parade, a beautiful space one can walk at leisure. A few years later, Robert Fairbairn comes up with this gigantic plan. This red dot's Malabar Point, the tip of Malabar Hill. This is Colaba Point. And he says, everything in between, let's landfill. Let's completely fill it up. For reference, this is Fort. The new reclamation would have been 25 times larger than Bombay's Fort District. And then within this reclamation, he cut docks and railway stations. It was just to be a huge scheme. Marine Drive would not have existed, of course, had this reclamation happened. Mr. Fairbairn's reclamation scheme is disposed of in about as many words as I opine there are subscribers for shares. So this was a big failure. He was found a few years later in a state of delusion under a tree, and he died a pauper at his burial. There were 4 people present. So I think he thought a little too big, perhaps. 1 year later, William Walker comes up with this wet dock scheme. And this is Walker. I really like him. The book is dedicated to him. He was in Bombay from 1845 to 1865. And this was his idea. He said the very center of the island, it's the lowest point, right? Which we remember from the bathtub again. This area floods in the monsoon. He said, let's take this to our advantage. This is the Baikula area. And he says, let's locate Bombay's docks in the very center of the island. And the advantage to that is there's no need to then reclaim Back Bay. I like to think that Walker was possibly Bombay's first foreign environmentalist. It was a very sensitive scheme in terms of how resources were used efficiently for the benefit of the city. He said, if reclamation has to happen, let's do it on the east of the island rather than on the south, because the east, in terms of the geography and the existing dock facilities, a lot was happening. This didn't happen, of course, and the Back Bay scheme became Bombay's kind of big urban moment. This was the first large-scale reclamation from 1863. Part of it did happen, and this is the result. The profane hand of reclamative speculation has aimed a successful blow at a sacred beauty of nature, our Back Bay. So this was the sentiment from the local population. About 40 years later, New Bombay. And this is 1912. It's an interesting year. It's the same time New Delhi planning happens, right? So you have New Delhi and New Bombay, both at the same time. And the schemes look so similar. New Bombay has a central vista. It has a government complex at the end of that vista. And then it has a series of large public parks. Now, of course, World War I muddled this scheme. New Delhi proceeded, although curtailed. And one resident at the time said they're very tired of Bombay being given stepmotherly treatment. That was the exact phrase. I like that. These were the public parks that were to be just west of Churchgate Station. One economic scenario pegged the rupees 388 lakh scheme to be constructed on reclaimed land in 8 years as a profit-earning, debt-free asset by 2015. So we would have been in the plus 7 years now had that proceeded as planned. 1919, the war is over, a new scheme comes to the forefront for Back Bay. And the basic idea here is let's dig mud from the bottom of the Bombay harbor, kind of pump it through pipes across Colaba, and then dump it onto the rocky foreshore of Back Bay. And all of this was to be held behind a retaining wall, creating this new landmass. Now, one problem, that retaining wall didn't retain. It leaked like a tap, and all the mud that got picked up from the harbor, pumped across, then just flowed right into Back Bay. It was this real Sisyphean kind of disaster. Work was left incomplete, and this is what someone said in 1927. We are now condemned to gaze at something which, to put it in homely language, looks like nothing on earth. 1927, this is about 2017. I like that description. I do agree it looks like nothing on earth. This is that leaky seawall. It's still just floating in Back Bay aimlessly for close to 100 years now. About a decade later, there's an idea for an international airport at Back Bay. That's the leaky seawall, and then you see the runway there at the bottom left. I like to think or fear if this airport had happened, you'd have a whole segment of South Bombay population who would have never gone to the suburbs because there would have just been no need. Charles Correa, of course, we heard a beautiful quote that resonates with many. 1974, this was his plan for Back Bay. Again, for reference, that's our leaky seawall. And basically what Correa says is we can take this kind of disaster, this incomplete project, and make it something beautiful, again with minimal intervention. He says, let's welcome the sea in, let's create these promenades along that waterfront that would just kind of finesse, sculpt the edge and create these beautiful public spaces with buildings overlooking but stepping back. Of course, this unfortunately was never realized. And he was fighting against this plan, basically. This was the government of Maharashtra's plan for the same space, completely was to fulfill the reclamation and chop it into little rectangles, basically. Officials love to create little rectangles on empty plots of land. That was it. There was a central park, which bizarrely wasn't central. There was a heliport, a helicopter pad right next to it. I like to think that whoever made this drawing thought the public must be blown away by this design in many ways. Yeah. A few years later, 1984, of course, Indira Gandhi is assassinated. And just after that event, there's a grand plan for a statue of Indira Gandhi in Back Bay. in this kind of incomplete, yet to be sculpted reclamation. Oleg Komov, a Russian sculptor, was commissioned for this sculpture. And again, we don't have any exact images of his studio. Do have reference images of his sculpture. So what we said is, let's imagine what his studio space in Moscow would have looked like. This was it. The statue of Indira Gandhi is actually based on a model he made and was photographed with M.F. Hussein. We just recreated his studio in totality. This was it. Of course, this never happened, but this was the vision. The proposed site has been so chosen that the statue can be seen easily by people flying into Bombay, a la Statue of Liberty in New York. Now, Mr. Patel, who said this, I don't think he has a good geographic sense, because when you're landing in Bombay and you look to Back Bay, this is what you see. You see the Deonar dumping ground. Back Bay is miles and miles away. There's no way Indira Gandhi would have been seen, but that was kind of an easy catchphrase to use and help imagine this proposal. A few other skyscrapers also in the Marine Drive Back Bay area. This was from the 60s by Feroz Kudianwala. If any of you know the World Trade Centers in Cuff Parade, he designed those. This was a plan for a 102-story tower. Now, at that time, Usha Kiran was the tallest building in Bombay at 25 floors. This was just, leagues beyond that. It was too inefficient, never proceeded. 2008. Of course, you can recognize Marine Drive. That's as many of us know it today. OMA, very popular firm based out of the Netherlands, proposes India Tower. I like to think of it as this pie in the sky that you see on the left there. This was a competition. They did not win, and I think good for them, because it's a very, very kind of was a tumultuous plot that's still empty today. Same site, same competition. This was Foster and Partners' proposal. It was a 700-meter glass tower. It was tickling the troposphere, I like to call it. But just look at the scale. Look at the surrounding buildings. It's unbelievable to me. This was to be a LEED certified building as well, technically. Really, it's not a joke. And that's where we've come, right? Marine Drive in 1850s to 2008. This glass tower is right next to existing burial grounds, the same ones you see in the image on the right. It would have been. Now, I'll share a little bit about the book. That's just a taste of some of the projects. Those were basically water supply, drainage, a little bit of architecture and Marine Drive. There are about 16 typologies in Bombay Imagined, housing, all kinds of docks, etc. But I'm going to just talk a little bit about the written word, because this was for me a really exciting and fun part. Each project in Bombay Imagine is written with about 150 to 200 words. It's very concise. And I like to think of Amitava Kumar as really sculpting the writing in this book. I discovered this publication by him a few years ago, Writing Badly is Easy, and I loved it. I just loved it. When I downloaded this image, the file name, which I presume he had created, was jargonslayer2.jpg. And I love that idea. We're slaying jargon. There will be no jargon in this book. It's just straight to the point. It's humorous. It's exciting. It has surprise. It has no jargon. So that was a great start. Through that book, I met Anton Chekhov, a playwright and short story writer. And Chekhov had 6 principles that make for a good story. And I'd like to think we took these principles as best I could and put them into Bombay Imagined. 1, the absence of lengthy verbiage of a political, social, economic nature. Now, this was easy for me because in college, I only went to studio. I bunked all my other classes. So that was that was almost given. 2, total objectivity. I don't in any of the projects say I think this is good or bad or it has merit. It doesn't. I've just written about the project and I'll leave it to you and your conscience and your heart to deliberate and create your own judgment. 3, truthful descriptions of persons and objects. Now, one thing that irks me in books to no end is you have, especially nonfiction books, a lot of beautiful content, footnotes. Then you have to turn like hundreds of pages at the back and sort through them that just it bothers me. So each chapter, each story in the book, the footnotes are right next to the text. And that's one, so you can reference them easily and keep researching, keep exploring. And two, so you know I'm not making stuff up, because a lot of the quotes are, I think, so crazy that without that reference point, I'd be accused of making a lot of stuff up. For extreme brevity, uh, this was also quite easy because I wrote between 5 and 7. I'm an architect by day, so that was my writing time, quite limited and fruitful. Audacity and originality, number 5. And then 6, compassion. This is the hard one. I don't quite know what it means to write with compassion, but I like the ambition, so I keep kind of thinking on it. I wrote for 200 days straight. These were all pandemic days, and I loved it. Every evening when I went to bed, I was like, my mind was rushing because I knew what I was going to write about the next morning, and I couldn't wait to wake up. So that was really special. This was my morning writing. Every word, 62,000 words, were first written by hand. And Alden said this: most people enjoy the sight of their own handwriting as they enjoy the smell of their own farts. Right? It's a nice quote. So our cat Bonnie Stevens, she went over every word in the book. She was a copycat, however. So these are some pages. Thank you very much, and let's have a discussion now.
So, thanks. I told you it's a lovely presentation. I don't think there's one person here who wouldn't have enjoyed that amazing sort of just traipsing through the book, right? It is a lovely book. And I think we have about half an hour to talk about this. So part of it, I'll ask him some questions, and the other part, we'll throw the floor open to the audience. So please keep your questions ready. Don't make statements, ask questions. I think we'll talk about this in a couple of, say, about 4 strands is what I thought. One, your own journey and how this book came to be, and part of it you have already talked about, but also how you came to India and how you happened to, sort of stay on. We're all a little logically, I mean, and with enough, how should I say, reason, a little skeptical about white men who come and stay here. So, yeah, and then the second part would be about the book, how it's structured and the contents, research that went into it. Thirdly, Mumbai as the protagonist. Wonderful, beguiling, all kinds of weird things also, but there she is. And then taking the book as taking off from the book, because into some general questions about, how cities are formed, how do they become what they do, and then what can we see for our own future for various cities in India. So let's start with the first strand. So firstly, I must say that I enjoyed the book. After a long time, this was a book where you savor page by page. There are beautiful illustrations, beautiful maps. I think as an architect, we are all drawn to maps and plans, but there was something so, it was so immersive. Sort of you look at it and you go further and further into it, and you try to look at the small little squiggles, and the maps are so beautifully drawn. And the calligraphy, it's wonderful. And I was very much like Alice, what's a book without pictures kind of thing. The fact that it's chronological, and you have the so Robert didn't talk too much about this, but there's a little relief plan at the top left hand of each page, and there's a color coding on the edge, so you can really very easily jump into any sort of topic that you want to. I mean, in case you're like Robert, you'll jump directly into sewage. But anyway, and what he calls speculations, some of which you saw. Beautiful, absolutely stunning illustrations, almost works of art. And some of them, I mean, like I think my favorite was the flying cars, the cannons on Pedder Road. I don't know what, amazing. So, how did you, I mean, given that Indians are not very good at documentation, how was this? How did you get into this, and how did you go forward on this whole, I think, of research?
Great. Is this on? Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. Um, so the research actually was the problem with the book is each part got more fun. So like the writing was super fun because I actually did that last. The research was really special because I love maps. Because I'm an architect, I thrive on the visual, right? But before I was an architect, I was actually an artist, and I kind of keep that in my core. In high school, I did all art classes, and so art has always been really special to me. And then architecture built on that. So that's why I think a lot of the work in the book is so artistic. And then even the maps that we chose to publish are the ones that have a very artistic bent. They're just beautifully produced, and like that Crawford 400-acre park. In the 1860s, to create something with color was not easy. Like now we can just select fill and it's done. That was actually a watercolor. It was a hand painted map. So I think a lot of the research involved finding these images that were just really beautiful, and taking them and then kind of being committed to reproducing them really, really well. To keep that core essence. I think a lot can get lost, of course, in a bad reproduction. So that was the research was really special for that reason. Um, yeah, I don't know if that
Uh,
answers.
I was more concerned about the fact that you might not have had enough documentation. How did you find the
As
documentation?
the problem was cutting out actually. The more I searched, the more I found. At first, Fawaz and I, when we started working, we said it's going to be 100 projects, the book. Then became 150. Then we got to 175, and we just at 200 had to stop. I went to Blossoms 2 days ago, got a book, found a new unrealized plans. So they're just there everywhere. There's no shortage of content, fortunately. And the one challenge is the content is spread all over the world. It's not organized, right? So you just have to, it's almost like being in it for the long haul and just searching random places, like a report on drainage. You would never necessarily think there's going to be some really interesting, poop trains in this report, but
Sure,
they're
of
there.
course, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you kept it at 200 because the book is very heavy
It's
as it
too
is.
heavy. My Tina calls it a logistical nightmare. 2.5 kilograms.
Well, you can exercise with it, one on each hand.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I need to buy one more just for that. So, as an architect, we the preoccupation is more with built projects. So, this is with unbuilt projects. How did that happen?
Yeah. So this was actually a counterbalance. So my day-to-day work, I love it, but it is stressful. And building is stressful, right? That's the bottom line. It takes a lot of work with many people, and to then have kind of this kind of side project where I didn't have stress. It was just purely for fun, something that I relished. That was actually a really big relief, and that's why I limited the book to just the unbuilt. And because I also know firsthand what it feels like to put a lot of energy into something and then have it fall apart completely, right? It's demoralizing. So then to kind of pick up those pieces from other people's lives and kind of give them some continuity of thought, I thought that was for me, that was special, and I think for others as well.
Yeah, it kind of takes you back to your college days where you drew beautiful trees and sort of covered your building up and, lived in a little bit of a la la land. Good fun. What happens as you move through the book is because it starts in the 19th century and moves on all the way to the 21st, almost to the present, is that you see the way that the city through the unbuilt projects, it's almost as though you're seeing the building of Bombay. I mean, only when you you're sort of halfway through the book, you start realizing it, and. The kind of projects also keeps changing. So I think in the beginning you have a lot about reclamation and drainage,
water supply, yeah.
docklands,
Yeah.
defense, and then suddenly that moves into housing. And at some point you're talking about Dharavi, squatter resettlement, and then you start moving it further and you start seeing how the city is sort of crowding out all the ideas, and then it's just architecture. The last bit is pretty much architectural projects. So is that what you saw happening?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a really beautiful book, Never Built New York. Came out, I think, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And I think this is the big difference one of the big differences between New York and Bombay. Never Built New York, it's constantly buildings. There are a few other schemes, transportation, but by and large, it's buildings and it's large projects. Bombay, for hundreds of years, we're struggling to get water. It's like these basic things, these basic elements of life. We're struggling to get sewage out of the city. And these are things we still struggle with today. It's raining in Bombay. If it rains for more than like 6 hours, the whole of central Bombay is underwater. So I think the type of projects, they really speak to the city, and her unique challenges. And then coming back to that comment about, the book also speaks to the built. I like to think of it like a tug of war, right? And so in school we play tug of war, and I was typically like on the loser team. So like we would all be on the ground, and the victors are like celebrating, and everyone then knows the victors. So Bombay Imagined are like all the losers. But you hear who wins also through each project because it's tug of war. It's typically kind of two opposing sides that are struggling to get their scheme built, and this kind of just shines the light on the losers for a bit.
So would you say that, because you of course you only see what is built, but a lot of the process which goes behind that, all the unbuilt ideas never come to light. So a book like this, of course, brings that to sort of gives it the public exposure. So would you say that even when even now, if there are ideas which come out, they should be published?
Absolutely. I think especially, I'll speak specifically to Mumbai, because there's so many factors that go into a project being realized, majority of which have nothing to do with design or the quality of what they give to the city. There are just so many other factors, and I think to lose from public memory and public knowledge really great and meaningful ideas simply because they weren't realized is a big loss. And I think it's because of that loss of memory, especially, that you see so many projects in the city's history that just repeat. Although it's often like 100 years, 200 years apart, they just keep repeating because that memory is not kept.
But there are some things that we want our lawmakers to forget. There are certain projects which keep coming back again and again like bad pennies, and we really want them to be consigned to the dustbin. Absolutely. But do you think that this is something? So again, going back to the idea that we don't have very good documentation in India, and I think that's still a problem. Do you think that's a West versus East thing? And do you think that more documentation in the West leads to more, I won't say thoughtful, but at least a better sort of, you sort of move forward and you don't keep coming back and reinventing the wheel every time?
I would like to think that's the case, but I also don't think it is. Um, uh, I just like for the British, for example, they were just really great and continue to be really excellent archivists. They are so talented at archiving anything, even things that like don't belong to them. you know,
Especially,
yeah,
yeah,
especially
yeah,
things that don't belong.
British Museum,
Yeah, it's
case
it's
case in
amazing.
point.
It's amazing, and but obviously that's also not always a good thing. So I don't want to over celebrate that quality. But the fact is, they have done a fabulous job. You look at the Maharashtra State Archives in Bombay. Who here has heard of Maharashtra State Archives? Yeah, like nobody. It is amazing. It's an incredible. Oh, we got someone. Yeah. Thank you. You get a prize afterwards. It's such a beautiful space. And I mean, millions of pieces of archival material, things that, predate the material that predates the British. So there is work happening. There is a lot. It's just not. It's not well known. It's not in the public light, or it's so hard to access those spaces that it's people just give up on it. So that's access is another issue, but. Yeah, I mean, I could talk about this all day, but I love
Yeah,
I
we'll
love
come back. We'll
archives.
we'll come back to it later. Not archives. I'm talking about more like present. Yeah. Anyway, so coming to the next strand, which is Mumbai, great city, terrible place. Absolutely. And uh, how does a city like Mumbai even come to be? Because it's, as I said, when I look at it, I was looking at the plan of Manhattan and I was trying to transpose and see whether there are some similarities. It's but Mumbai is thriving. It's dying. It's reinventing itself. But it is still a thriving, fantastic place. How does that? How did that even happen? Why do you think it happened?
I mean, there's a lot of. I don't know if I'm quite the right person to answer that, but you just have a lot of global events that kind of set Bombay up, right? The American Civil War really set Bombay up, and at the same time, the Suez Canal opens. So you have these global events which
You
just
mean cotton?
yeah, with the cotton boom and trading, that these really set Bombay on the course to be geographically ready, right? And people capitalized on that. So I mean that was really the big start in terms of business, and then of course it crashed and came back. Um, but yeah, I don't know exactly what it is, but Bombay is a great place. And it continues to be a great place with a lot of incredible ideas. Unfortunately, it's also unlivable in many ways, and that's the challenge that I think we all struggle to deal with.
So Korea, sort of I think his one of the strong premises that I mean, points he made about Bombay was the fact that it had this linear transport passage, which was sort of bequeathed by the GIP and the, so uh, because it had that spine, uh, it succeeded. Now, I just want to. Your wife is Bengali, so forgive me, all Bengalis here. But Calcutta, for example, if you Calcutta, a great city at one point of time, and but if you compare now Calcutta and Bombay, uh, there is no parallel economically. There is no parallel, or even as a city. So, what do you think? So, I mean, I'm really interested in that as a
Well,
as an idea.
I have never thought of that. um, I don't know. I really don't know what it is. But it is. And I would have to think a little more deeply on that question to answer it well. Apart from people, I mean, people ultimately, at the end of the day, people make cities.
And is it diversity of people?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think uh, absolutely, and Bombay had that, right? It had that diversity. So I think my gut feeling is the core answer of that is is the people, as residents change over centuries. Yeah.
Is it also the fact that, in some strange way, because Bombay is it's an island and land is can be created by just reclaiming the from the sea. So you can go on expanding. Now, if Bangalore wants to expand, it just has to keep going further and further into the hinterland, and it becomes more and more inefficient. But Bombay, in some strange way, can become more efficient by taking land from the sea. Does that work in its? Has it worked? Because now you've seen, I think, quite a few of those
That's
reclamation
that's a
projects.
loaded that's a loaded question. Um, uh,
A lot of mud.
yeah, yeah. Time will tell. I'll say that because we're reclaiming now, the west on the west coast. I think time will tell if that is a solution. I don't think it will be, um, but I'll allow history to answer that in the future.
Another question on Bombay about the city on water. Again, uh, something that many of the people featured in your book, all of them tried to bring the city back to the harbor and to the seafront and to the waterfront in multiple ways. But it's not really a city on the water. Yeah, on it's not. I mean, I can think of many cities which have that feeling of being a waterfront city, but not Bombay really.
Yeah, absolutely. And Korea, of course, tried really hard to make it to return Bombay to that city by the sea. William Walker, who you met, he proposed in the early 1860s, just like Connie Bear, like a marine drive to bring people to the waterfront. So there have been many plans, and just for some reason, we have failed miserably at making the sea accessible to the pedestrian. We've been very good at putting roads along the sea.
But is that an Indian thing? Because we seem to, strangely, we have cities on water, always, I mean, on the next to rivers, because that's where, all civilizations, sort
Yeah.
of, the cities grew around a source of water that was so critical to it. But mostly they've turned their back.
Yeah.
So now these are all now,
Absolutely.
just for sewage and
Yeah.
sullage, and that's it, not to be
Yeah.
enjoyed.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean that's unfortunate, and I can go through my daily routine for weeks on end in Bombay and not see the ocean, and it's it's a few
Amazing.
it's a not even a kilometer away. So many have thought, many have tried, and just we constantly fail, and why exactly that is, I'm not sure, and it's been consistent for centuries, this failure to capitalize on the waterfront. Yeah.
So I just, from your book, what are your favorite what if, I will say, uh, eh, like I kept thinking if Dharavi, redevelopment was thought about in the 1920s, and what if? So what are your favorite what ifs which you think might have changed the face of Bombay?
So yeah, I have a different favorite every week. Although I think although I have been consistent with one, I think Ajit Bhattacharyaji's plan for no cars is my favorite. I
Oh,
just
absolutely. That was
Yeah, I love it. I
quite
just
radical.
Yeah, totally, totally. Um, and because I mean, I think that's possibly the biggest challenge facing every city in India is these overwhelming number of metallic objects that take up huge amounts of space for one or two people. And like what I love about Ajit Bhattacharyaji's plan, he was completely serious. Like he wasn't just saying kuch bhi, he wasn't just flying a kite. Like he was the resident editor of the Times of India at the time. He wasn't, he was like in a very senior position, very reputed position, and this was a serious plan. And just imagine if that had happened, there would have actually been investment in public transport. There would have been investment to make it, more frequent, more efficient, more comfortable, and all those things which our public transport systems in Bombay are not, by and large, or with exceptions. So I think that's something that has really like that gives me dreams at night. Yeah.
But even if you see, I mean, I'm going to take a Western example, but if you see the US versus Europe, you can, it's drastically different, though both prosperous Western, entities. Um, why is it that India is going the American way instead of going the European way
Yeah, and it's a
in terms of transport
yeah, and the
and so
problem
on?
is our densities are so much higher that in the 1950s and 1960s, Bombay invited Wilbur Smith, who is from the great state of South Carolina, my home state. He was like a heavyweight in transportation planning in the 50s. They invited him to Bombay. He drew all these roads, north, south, east, west across the city, and that's what everyone thought at the time was the solution to moving in cities. And it was, of course, purely a Western model. And much of it was built. The coastal road today that's being built is basically his plan from the 1960s. And these are just their outdated means of movement, unfortunately. And that's been the kind of cookie cutter solution that has been implemented. And we're suffering and we're going to suffer until we change course somehow. Like there's no other future, unfortunately.
So that sort of leads into my next question, which is: do you see a different way of planning? Do you see a different way of
Yeah.
how the cities are going to be imagined?
Yeah.
Because the other thing is, I don't, we've seen. There are probably many architecture students here and architects here, but most of us are not thinking beyond the project, beyond the site boundaries. What do you think should be the way of the future?
Yeah. So the end of the book, there are a handful of projects that I think of as like recycling projects. They kind of are based on a premise that our cities are deeply flawed. They need urban interventions that are micro scale and can be done at a very intimate neighborhood level. And I love that because I personally think that's the future of cities. Rather than big plans that like New Bombay from 1912, where we're casting this 200-acre layout and big roads, and going into our cities as they are, identifying the problems, finding opportunities for intervention that are minimal, that recycle what's already there, and make them meaningful pieces of infrastructure for whatever purpose they are. In Bombay, I'll give a reference. In Bombay, there was this empty hillside, almost like an alley, but slightly sloped near Mount Mary. A firm by the name of Abraham John Architects transformed it into just steps, right? Something as simple as steps that go from top to bottom. That's one of Bandra's richest public spaces now. And they basically just recycled what was there in this very kind of messy and dirty site. And I personally think that's the future, having these small localized interventions. The book has a handful of them. And I think it's our family has benefited from it. So I'll say that much.
So, speaking from the other side of the line, where we've been trying to do some small interventions, the problem, I mean, again, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. It's nice to say small interventions, and of course, they're cute, they're nice, they work also, of course, very well. But unless there is a larger, so this city is like this heaving monster, right? There are millions of small things which are constantly dynamically changing, and they change how the city behaves minute to minute. And then there's a small handful of people who are making huge interventions which then may foil or may run along with those, and this tension is always there. But somehow, the larger changes which can be much more impactful are those changes are fairly misdirected, because they're mostly with this nexus of politics and crime and money and so on. So how does one negotiate that?
I don't know if we can, honestly, and that's why I think I've seen a lot of firms try to negotiate that and be frustrated. And I'm not saying we shouldn't try, but I think we also have to take small victories where we can and build on those. So I think it's a balance. You know, our cities are complex places. The forces that control how land is used and built upon or not built upon are extremely powerful and often way beyond our influence. So finding these small moments, I think, are still, for me, they're the starting point. And maybe in our lifetime, in our children's lifetime, that will be the way forward. And it's one of the things I've enjoyed in the book is, Bombay, the first project is 1670, 350 years ago. It kind of feels like yesterday.
Yes.
Some
Some of those schemes, yeah.
cities have long lives oftentimes, and I think we often get too stuck in our own timelines of 1 year, 5 years. Maybe it will take 100 years for something systematically to change. So perhaps then someone will write a book about what we're struggling with now.
Yeah. So I think we'll throw the floor open for audience questions.
Y'all have been a fabulous audience. Thank you.
Thanks. It's been amazing. I think Robert and I were with Bangalore traffic being what it is. We thought we counted 2 and 2, 4, 5. So it's wonderful. Please introduce yourself and maybe your profession, and then ask the question.
I'm Janvi Phalke. I'm a historian of science. So I like the fact that you highlight the one vision, which was the unrealized vision of a city without cars. Growing up in Bombay, it's the one city where it was actually possible to grow up without having cars. It still is, to a large extent, which it's not possible in many other metros in India, right? So while it's a good vision to have, and I think what I see in the compilation you made is visions unrealized. And they symbolize something. And as a historian, I appreciate that, right? Because the path's not taken, roads not traveled, and therefore what the implications of that are. But I think just like we are not able to maintain documentation, I wonder if you're not able to read history in a good way. And I'll explain why I asked this question. Because when we look at urban America, especially starting the 30s, but mainly since the Second World War, a large part of the creation of suburban America was a response to the anticipation of a nuclear disaster, right, or a nuclear bombing. And therefore, put people away from the city centers such that you don't lose on everything, including your working populations and everything at one go if you're bombed out. So there's history there. So what I want to ask you is, in your reading, now you've looked at unrealized plans, you've probably also examined to some extent the realized ones. Do you see things there? Do you see the rationale behind the decisions taken and why they were taken the way they were taken, why things were rejected the way they were rejected? Just in order to understand the history which we are unable to read, right? Like, so that's my feeling that, there's something happening there. It's not as ad hoc. We're not able to compile good stories because there's not good documentation, but I actually find it quite hard to believe, and I'm not at all saying that you say that, but I find it quite hard in the public domain and in public debate when we often sort of just dismiss questions like, oh, it's ad hoc, it's haphazard, it's interested, it's biased, it's lobbies, it's this, it's that. So is there something you observe that where we can actually read history in an interesting manner to understand why Bombay developed the way it did? And, going back to that question, it was still possible to grow up in Bombay without a car, as a result of which I suffer, of course, now because I don't know how to drive.
Thank you. So the first question there, the car will come back to. Can you just, repeat that, the question once more?
Why are the
Yeah, so the decisions, thank you. Sorry, I went blank. Wherever I found a very clear, precise reason, it's in the book. And it's sometimes having to do with cost. It's often having to do with political will. Sometimes it is lobbies. New Bombay, to a large extent, I write, did not happen because bureaucrats did not want to move from South Bombay. Simply put, they enjoyed the comforts of South Bombay too much to relocate themselves and their offices, across the harbor. Um, so again, wherever the reasons were clear, I wrote it. Wherever they weren't, I had to say, it was left open ended specifically. And then I would like to think the majority of those justifications for, rejection for a particular path, a particular reason, are then in the footnotes. So if one wants to then dive in from a historical perspective and really research and get into the nitty gritty, who is behind these decisions, which groups, which individuals, that content's there. So that's kind of one side. And then the thing about cars, we don't have a car in Bombay, and it's great, but it also has that also causes other issues in terms of having the number of autos we have, and then just there are other associated issues. Maybe that's another talk for another time. But yeah.
I was asking about patterns, right?
About?
Do you see patterns? Is there a way to read that history rather than patches of this plant rejected, that plant rejected? Is there something to see, like American suburbanization? I mean, the suburbanization of America
Yeah.
is because of these particular
Got it.
triggers.
Got
Do you
it.
see such triggers?
Yeah, I don't offhand. I've not thought deeply about that question, but my gut feeling is no. And that's partly because decision makers have so quickly changed in Bombay's history. You look, our government changed like 2 weeks ago, overnight. The consistency of leadership is very weak. And I think because of that, a lot of decisions that are taken kind of follow this. And I'm sorry, you may not like it, but it is a bit ad hoc at times, including historically. But I would be interested if you do see patterns. I would be intrigued to hear what they might be. While she's making the trek, since you mentioned the nuclear bomb, in 1962, P.G. Patankar designed the suburban railway network for Bombay. And in the text he wrote, the underground stations are useful in case, our urban centers come under attack. And when I read that, I thought, how is that relevant today? And then, just as the book came out, the Ukraine invasion happened, and you see, cities being relocated to underground metro stations. And I thought of Patankar, and how our cities are still, are still responding to that threat. Interesting. Sorry, you spurred that thought, so I was just sharing it. Go ahead, please.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Stuti. I work in urban tech innovation now, but was actually in the '07 to '10 time in real estate with the developer in Bombay. The question for me when I saw those plans in '07, we're now moving towards conceptually in many cities the 15-minute city, or very Jane Jacobsian kind of neighborhood, cityscapes that really work. In these 200 projects, did you see, a concept of this kind of microcosms, micro experiments, but cities that work in that 15-minute radius? Question one. And if today you look at as a Bombay resident, which area or neighborhood would you pick for that experiment? Because India's kind of came up this, micro neighborhoods, and now we're suddenly commuting anywhere. We're taking cars everywhere. So where would it really fit?
Yeah, great, fantastic questions. Thank you. So I do not live a 15-minute city life, unfortunately. I reside in Bandra. Office is in Fort in Kalagoda. So I guess then I'm an hour and 15-minute city. So couple of, I like to actually think William Walker's. I showed that plan for the dock, moving the dock to the center of the island. In many ways, that would have been a 15-minute city. He was saying, let's take Bombay's most popular commercial activity, put it bang in the middle. So then you have this almost radial access where everyone's a bit close, rather than isolating everything at the very southern tip of the city, which Back Bay Reclamation was doing. So I think Walker was quite an efficient thinker in that sense and had that vision, what we call the 15-minute city. The other one that really stands out to me is Claude Batley. Many of you have heard of him, architect, English architect. He taught at JJ for decades. He, 20 years before Charles Correa said, let's split Bombay into two, Claude Batley said, let's split Bombay into 25 cities. He said, it's too big, it's too overbearing. Let's split the city into 25 coastal townships. He said, then we'll have efficient centers for life. I love that. Everything was to be each of the 25 cities was to be self-contained. And it was to have, everything. And he said, especially for individuals who are not married or young couples with no kids, he said it would be extremely efficient for them to live in community with other people. So I quite like that idea and think you might have enjoyed it as well. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you what were, among the recent proposals, what were some very ridiculous proposals or some really fun proposals? And why didn't any of them happen given that Bombay is and was till the new cities where the capital shifted, the richest Indian city, is perhaps still the richest Indian city in many ways.
I think our corporation is the richest in the country. So it's often not money. Sometimes it is, but often not. The most ridiculous recent idea. Well, I have to be very careful here, not get in trouble. Someone when the book.
Might be echoed here in Bangalore.
Yeah. So I'll tell you, when I put projects in the book, I didn't necessarily put them because I liked them or didn't like them. I put them because they led to a path of discovery about the urban history of the city that I would not have gone on otherwise. So, like for example, D Coop made a competition entry for a hostel. Right? And I love that because I started researching hostels, right? Student accommodation in Bombay. What's the past look like for hostels and students who have just been like pulling their hair out to find a place to live? So yeah, that's aside. The most ridiculous idea. I have it actually. Thank you. And it's a government project, so I don't have to worry. So we have this thing called Princess Dock in Bombay. It was one of the earliest docks in the 1800s. It was constructed. They basically excavated in rock on the eastern edge of the city, the harbor side, excavated dock, named it Princess Dock. Very popular. Hundreds of thousands of ships would have used it. In the early 2000s, it was filled up. Okay, it was filled up with mud. Basically, the dock was reclaimed, and it became the storage facility for an offshore container shipping kind of network. Then I think it was 3 years after that reclamation was complete, the government came up with a plan to excavate the dock and make it a marina. That's crazy. Like literally, it was nothing, excavated to a dock, filled up, and then re-excavated into a luxury yacht dock. So I just think that's completely wild. I anticipate it will happen because it is part of a bigger scheme for the Eastern Waterfront, which, in my gut guesstimation, will happen in the next 10 years. So let's see. So if you see a marina, a fancy, swanky, luxury marina in Bombay in the near future, you can think that's ridiculous. Yeah.
Robert, I was just reminded of this. There was a very popular advertisement about 15 years ago about a motorcycle. It said, "Fill it, forget it," So they just forgot. But William Walker's proposal to relocate beer kegs.
That was brilliant. Yeah,
Please talk
this was
about it. It's
also.
I thought it's
I'm not a big beer drinker. I like red wine. I picked it up in the pandemic, but William Walker, you remember him, no? That man. He had this really interesting idea. He walked around Bombay's Fort district, and he got frustrated because already Fort's this congested, very tight, like a urban condition. He would look inside all the ground floors of these shops and just see these big barrels of beer that were fermenting. They were just being stored in Fort. And he was basically like, that's ridiculous. We should not have, beer being stored in Fort. He said we should take the beer, move it to Suri, where there's a lot of space, open, expansive land, build go-downs, store all the beer there, and then put people in offices and residences where the beer used to be sleeping. So it was just really logical. But what's fantastic about that proposal is today, if you go on Google and you need to store something in Bombay, right? Storage is a big menace. It's a real big mess. We faced it when we had hundreds of boxes of these books. Where do we store it? Not in our house, of course, because Kaidav, our son, won't let us in the house if it's all filled up with books. So we searched, where can we find a storage space? In Suri. There's these big empty warehouses where you can store things. And I used to think Walker, he was bang on. 100 years before entrepreneurs caught on and said, let's give people this facility, he said, we should create it for beer. So quite a brilliant and exciting idea.
it's quite a likely scheme here in Bangalore with the breweries and well.
Any more questions?
Maybe just an addition to that, any project in the book that would have been transformative to Bombay if it had been seen through?
Would have been in a good way or in a good way? I think the poop train was very good.
Lots of bad projects which were transformative, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Very
Yeah.
few nice ones that you can think
I think
of.
the poop train would have been really good because at that 1869, I believe the only underground railway in the world was in London at that time. New York, I think, might have been under construction or just completed. Just imagine Bombay would have been the second or third city in the world with an underground railway network. That would have been transformative if it had been successful in terms of its use, because you look at the train network today, it's miserable. You have 7 million people, including myself, clambering for not even space to sit, but a space to stand. It's inhumane. It's not nice, and cities should be nice. So I think the Underground Railway would have chartered a new course at a very important time period. It would be about 100 years before Patankar came in and said, let's design a subway, network. And even then, people said it's too expensive. Now we're constructing it 150 years too late, and it's a hassle. It's destroying, the city temporarily to construct this, which should have been done centuries ago. So yeah, I think we would have got ahead of the curve. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you.